So it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the Kirby Laing Centre for Public Theology in Cambridge, and especially for the topic that we're addressing today. So it wasn't long ago that the war in Ukraine had been going for 1 year, and I myself at the start of the war put a small Ukraine flag in a flower pot outside my entrance, and that is now weathered and the colors are muted, but it still flies there as I wait for the conclusion of this dreadful war. So it's a very, very important meeting we're having today, and thank you for making the time to join us for it. Now, of course, I'm really excited to welcome Michael Shipster, and I thought rather than introducing him, Michael, I will ask you just a few questions so that we can learn a bit about you. Okay. So I now live in Cambridge, but I nevertheless have to say that you attended a great university and a great college. And while you were there, you became very close friends with a great poet. Can you tell us about these things?
Yes, I was at St Edmund Hall, colloquially known as Teddy Hall. Has a sort of rather sporty reputation, but they also do teach serious subjects. I did PPE, and in my third year, I found that I had rooms next to Chris Mann, a South African Rhodes Scholar, and I think that encounter, it's fair to say, changed the course of my life in all sorts of ways, not least because after becoming close friends, and then in my first role after Oxford, I went to Botswana to work for the Botswana government as an economist. My life of deception began at this moment because PPE does many things, but it doesn't qualify to work for anybody as an economist. That was an absolute life-changing experience. And in my first Christmas out in Southern Africa, Chris Mann invited me to his house in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, where I met his sister, Jackie. 18 months later, we were married in Botswana in our little house on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. And we had some 46 years of very happy marriage until, unfortunately, Jackie died of cancer 2.5 years ago. And I regret to say that my dear friend Chris also died of cancer 2 years ago. This week, in fact, I could be with him just before he died. But I was very blessed with a very happy marriage with Jackie, three children, all grown up, and very blessed in my very close friendship with Chris Mann. I'll pause there.
Indeed, indeed. So just for those of you who don't know, PPE is not that stuff they used for nurses and doctors during COVID. It's philosophy, politics, and economics, which is a degree I would always have loved to have done. Now, Michael, I don't know if you can answer this question, but how did you come to be a diplomat?
Well, I applied. in my final year in Oxford, I mean, those are the days when you could basically choose what you wanted to do, and then you had a wonderful choice of, many decent options. So I applied to a number of things, mostly with an overseas and aid focus. But I also applied to the Foreign Office. I went through the whole sort of exams board of sort of selection board and final board. I was offered a post. But at the same time, I was lucky enough to be accepted as an Overseas Development Institute fellow in Botswana for initially a 2-year period. And the Foreign Office was quite shocked and disappointed when I said to them, thank you very much for offering me a job, but I've got this other job, which I quite like to do for a couple of years. Can I apply again when I come back? And they said, well, you'll have to go through the whole process again because we'll have other people there. They may be better than you. I said, I'll take that chance. I'm off to Africa. So, in the end, I was away for 5 years. I was in Botswana extended for a couple of years, and then Jackie and I traveled back to Britain on our motorcycle. And in those days, you could drive from Africa to, take a ship to India, and then we went around the sort of long way via Kashmir, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. It's not a journey that you could easily do these days. And then I did postgraduate degree, and then I threw it all away and became a diplomat.
And can you tell us, Michael, where in the world you served as a diplomat? And then, now this is a really important question, which place did you enjoy the most?
Well, I was lucky that I had, I think I would say, 4 very different and substantial postings. The first was to the Soviet Union. I went there at the beginning of 1981, having learned Russian for a year. And that was at the time that the Soviet Union was showing the first signs of cracking up, though, as far as I'm aware, nobody really predicted that it would, within the decade, disappear. And then after a spell in London, I was posted to India, which was for 3.5 years. Absolutely, wonderful experience, quite a different context. And from there, I was cross-posted to Zambia, and then after that to South Africa, primarily with a focus on the ANC and the transition to democracy, because Lusaka was the headquarters of the ANC. And although Mrs. Thatcher, our Prime Minister at the time, had been rather disobliging towards the ANC, describing them as a 3-letter terrorist organization, which they didn't particularly like, nor did I, for that matter. But at the same time, she was keen to have a dialogue with the leaders of the ANC, and that dialogue was conducted in Lusaka and sometimes in London. And I was lucky enough to have that position for a year. And then, catastrophe of catastrophes, Mandela was let out of jail, and all the ANC started leaving Lusaka. And I thought, well, Lusaka is a very nice place, but without a really serious function here, I could get a little bit bored. But fortunately, someone had the wisdom to post me to Johannesburg, where I continued the role of acting as a kind of point of contact with the ANC during those crucial years, 1990, 91 to 94, when the election happened in April. Mandela was elected president after a period of time when it looked as if the whole process would fall apart. And then later on that year, 1994, I was posted back to London. And then, just to finish the story, I had one further overseas posting, which was the United States after the Iraq War in 2004. And just before that, I'd been appointed the director for the Middle East and Africa after 9/11. And that was a period of great change, peril, and uncertainty. And I mean, from a professional point of view, it was a very rewarding time, and I felt very fortunate to be at the centre of those sort of epoch-making events. And then finally, to answer your question, which of those do I look back on with most pleasure is not probably the right word, but with the most affection and commitment? And the answer is South Africa.
Oh, you got the right answer. You got the right answer.
Almost everything about it was aligned. Jackie was South African. She was near her family. I believed in what we were trying to do, we as a country, and I was dealing with the future government, as I firmly believed at the time. I was not in any way unbiased about this. and I believe that the best way to help South Africa was to ensure a peaceful transition. So for all those reasons, I found that a very rewarding and satisfying experience.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's extraordinary, Michael, the journey that you've been on, you know, and I hope in future meetings we can just hear something of the rich tapestry, you know, in terms of what you can tell us. So I'm going to hand over now to Michael to address us on the article that we published in the Big Picture. In my opinion, just an outstanding piece, Hinges of History, how the war in Ukraine has changed the world. And we've also invited Michael to update us in relation to this article. And then after that, I will attempt a response, and then we'll go to Q&A. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Greg. I'm not going to recap the article. I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with it. It was really quite clear to me when the invasion began that this was not just another stage in the sort of long-running saga of the West's relationship with Russia and just another event along that road, but something that would really change the weather in the world, and not just in Ukraine itself and in Europe. And I think you know, I was not alone in that. It was not a sort of unique insight. I mean, I felt exactly the same way when I was in my office, watched the planes hit the Twin Towers in 2001, realizing that this was, you know, life was not going to be the same after this. So that said, you know, why were so many predictions about, you know, what was going to happen, including whether it would happen? Why were they so way off at the time? I suppose one reason was that people found it quite extraordinary to believe that Putin had a strategic objective that could be served by invading Ukraine in that way at that time. I mean, one of his miscalculations was that he could do it with, you know, 200,000 troops and achieve his major objectives within, you know, three days a week at most. Equally, I think the West, I include, you know, British government, obviously, you know, it goes without saying, I have no direct role in British government affairs these days. I retired in 2006, although I worked subsequently for an international corporation. I've not been directly plugged into British government thinking, but I think it's been quite transparent how people have reacted to the invasion, and I think that a number of assumptions on the Western side proved to be false too, which was that, first of all, Putin would have a good chance of succeeding in capturing Kiev, and possibly capturing or even killing Zelensky, or at least driving him out of the country, that the Ukrainians had no stomach to fight. They didn't have the means to do so. And the West was committed to not risking a direct confrontation with Russian forces, the overriding objective being to avoid a war between the great powers, which could be utterly catastrophic for the countries concerned and indeed for the planet. Now, a number of those assumptions proved to be incorrect, and seriously so, none more than for Putin and his military leaders, who were surprised at the effectiveness and commitment of the Ukrainian forces, which stopped the major incursion from the north, from Belarus to Kiev, stopped them from capturing the airport, which was of crucial strategic importance, and then using very simple technology, particularly in avionics, drones, and communications, satellite photography, and battlefield intelligence. They were able to inflict extremely heavy casualties on a lumbering convoy of armor which was stranded and became sitting ducks. Meanwhile, in the east, the Russians made quite rapid gains, particularly along the coast, reaching Mariupol and eventually capturing Kherson. But it was far, far more difficult and far more costly than they ever imagined. And it's still not clear what the actual casualties were or have been or are. But figures have escalated from an admitted sort of 10,000 to 40,000, and it's not far-fetched to suppose that the Russian losses in this war have reached dead and wounded, seriously wounded, over 200,000. Compare that with something in the region of 12 to 15,000 in Afghanistan in the 9 years that the Soviet forces were involved there, and you get an idea of how costly this campaign has been. And in my article, I mentioned that the gross miscalculation of the Soviet leadership in intervening in Afghanistan in 1979 can be linked ultimately to the collapse of the Soviet Union after the Soviet withdrawal, having achieved none of their objectives, and in fact made the situation there far worse for their interests. In 1988, and the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and Germany was reunified in 1990, and the Soviet Union dissolved itself in 91, 92. So you have an idea of the potential for a disastrously miscalculated foreign adventure that might, what the consequences of that might be for the state as a whole. And I think that is one of the big unknown questions as to how deeply Russia will feel that miscalculation and what the consequences will be. And I'll sort of pause there with this final word, which is that a collapse of the Putin regime with replacement of Putin himself, and deep fissures opening up in the Russian administration, government, military, intelligence, and so on, would not necessarily make things any easier for the rest of the world. In fact, there are unique perils associated with that chaos and disintegration. So I think probably I'll pause for breath at that point, Craig, and you can perhaps ask me to pick up on any of the other points which were featured in the article and which might be worth pursuing now.
Okay. So, Michael, would you like me to respond, do my formal response now? And then
sure.
Because we're in good time, and so I will keep to my 15 or 20 minutes, and then you can respond to me. We'll have time for that. Is that all right?
Yes, I mean, I'm conscious that I've left a huge amount out, particularly concerning the last 6 months of the campaign, where the military sort of fortunes of war have been, again, equally surprising. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, and now the mobilization of an extra 300,000 to 500,000 Russians. 1 million Russians have gone abroad to avoid the draft. Dissent at home has been suppressed. New technologies have been introduced. There's the possibility of a disastrous miscalculation in NATO forces and Russian forces coming together. I mean, the collision in the air over the Black Sea of a US drone and a Russian fighter. I think it's a very, very small incident, but it's a foretaste of what could happen. And I think that the dangers of escalation in this war remain acute, and they pose some of the greatest dangers to peace and stability in not only Europe, but around the world that we've seen since the Second World War. The stakes are still very high.
Yeah, so maybe I can just ask you two questions, Michael, before we go on to my response. So one is, has the way in which the West has been united so far, and, you know, not just the West, I mean, the 50 countries meeting once a month to provide military aid, has that surprised you?
To a certain extent, yes. But I think that the shock of a land war in Europe, the invasion on the scale that has occurred of a European country seeking a closer rapprochement relationship with Europe by its aggressive neighbor, I think it's been a real wake-up call for most of the countries of Europe. And with a democratic president, or at least a non-Trumpian president in the White House, I think that the United States administration has recognized that this is a battle not just for a corner of Europe. It's not just a territorial dispute between two rather faraway countries, but a challenge to the values and ideals of an entire way of life. And that what's happening in Ukraine is a battle in which we are all invested. And in these circumstances, I think the machinery of dialogue, of diplomacy, of collaboration has worked quite well. I mean, as it should, because it's been in existence for 70 plus years, particularly NATO and its meshing with the European Union. The European Union has certainly stepped up to this challenge. And I think that the key country there is obviously Germany, which had most to lose from a collapse of its relationship with Russia, but has recognized that this is a challenge that it could not avoid. And a united front in Europe was particularly important in seeking to avoid a bad outcome and trying to work for a much better one. And I think countries like Sweden and Finland, which have taken a very, very sharply, different direction in seeking the collective security of NATO membership, is emblematic of how seriously countries in Europe, without too much cajoling or pressure, have embraced in order to manage this crisis and to try and steer everybody through without making it very much worse.
Yeah, indeed. So, a bit of a provocative question, but I think an important one. So, we are seeing some of the Republicans and potential leaders of the Republican Party trying to get back to the more isolationism that we saw under Trump. Does this concern you at all?
It does. I mean, I think there is if the polls are to be believed, there is a substantial section of particularly the Republican Party, that believes that the heavy investment in Ukraine's defense is at the expense of essential domestic interests of the United States, and is not justified by any great strategic interest of the United States in this conflict. Whether that is a vote grabbing posture, recognizing that the election is not, for another 20 months or so, remains to be seen. A lot can happen in 20 months. That's more than doubling the length of time that this conflict has been going on. And goodness, we've seen some extraordinary developments in that time. This conflict is not going to look the same, in the autumn of 2024 when Americans go to the polls. And I mean, it's not confined to the Republican Party. I think a lot of people wonder, well, are we going to make ourselves hostage to Ukrainian intransigence and determination to recapture all of the territory that Russia has taken, including that which was seized in 2014, including the Crimea, because that's quite an ambitious military objective, and it may not be attainable. So one of the outcomes is that this is going to be a long war, and whether or not the West, particularly the United States, has the stomach for that, I think is a very important and potentially worrying question.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, two questions. I mean, I could keep asking because it's so fascinating to hear your reflection. So there are quite a few of us on the Zoom from the majority world, several of us like myself from South Africa, and you know, you've lived in the majority world. What do we make of the fact that a country like South Africa, which knows what oppression looks like, can't find, its leadership can't find the courage or the desire to condemn the invasion?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, it's one of the things that when I was preparing for this discussion, I was asking myself, how does the rest of the world feel about this? Why is it that looking at the numbers, so many countries chose not to condemn Russia during the debate and the vote that was taken a couple of weeks ago, coinciding with the first anniversary. But let's be clear about this: 141 countries condemned it. Against were only 7: Russia, Belarus, Eritrea, Mali, North Korea, Syria, and Nicaragua. I mean, this is not, you know, an A team likely to win the World Series, you know, in any kind of contest. These are very slim pickings for Russia as allies. Of the 32 that abstained, I think the motivations were mixed. I think some of them, I'd say South Africa would be included, like to hedge their bets, nor do are they natural allies of a sort of unipolar, hegemonistic world led by the United States. They also, which I find extraordinary because, you know, history has moved on, retain a sentimental attraction and admiration for Russia, even though Russia is hardly, you know, going to match, you know, the stated ideals of a great liberation movement as it was, you know, in 1990 when they came back to South Africa. It's almost as if they just haven't appreciated that the Russia of today is a deeply repressive, divided, unequal, manipulative regime, which it's hard to believe that you'd want to call your best friend. But I think there are a number of factors there, and countries like India and China, I can understand why they would not want to vote against Russia at this point. They prefer to stand aside. And that doesn't mean that they sympathize with Russia or recognize, you know, the legitimacy or any kind of legitimacy in Russia's aims. It just means that they do not want to stand up, you know, with countries that they don't feel quite so easy about going to the same lobby with. I think they feel that gives them a certain amount of leverage. And frankly, you know, cheap Russian oil and energy and other raw materials and the opportunities to trade are pretty powerful incentives when you've got a very needy, hungry country to feed and to sustain. So I mean, I personally feel very surprised that South Africa should have organized for its military to conduct exercises at sea with the Russian Navy around about the time of the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. I personally think that's inept and unnecessary and rather indicative of immaturity and ill judgment on the part of the South African government.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So we're going to move now on to my somewhat formal response. I'm going to try and keep it to about 15 minutes, and then we'll give Michael any time he wants to respond. And then please start thinking of your questions, because this is an important discussion and it's an incredible opportunity to have Michael with us and the opportunity to hear from him. So just, you know, the title Hinges of History, as I thought about it, it struck me that this is a very provocative and evocative title. And hinges are the thing that a door moves on and opens or closes. And, you know, the worrying thing is that if a door is being opened in history, what lies on the other side of the doorway? So, and, you know, what this makes me think, and what I would encourage us to do, and what the Kirby Laing Centre wants to promote, is that if this could be a hinge of history, we really need to think very hard about what is going on in Russia and Ukraine today. And one of my concerns is with the West, and not least with the Western churches, that our memory is so short, and that we don't feel the need somehow to think and reflect hard on what may be changing our world in front of our eyes without us noticing. I often refer to George Weigell's comment about John Paul II, that John Paul II scouted the future in order to guide the mission of the church. Now, as the pandemic reminds us unequivocally, prophecy in the sense of prediction is a dangerous and speculative business. I don't know that any of us prophesied or predicted the pandemic. And we cannot actually scout the future. But I think what John Paul was doing is correct, because the opposite extreme is equally dangerous. That we never stop to ask if a hinge of history is upon us, where could this lead? Where might this lead? And how do we think and prepare for those possibilities? So that seems to me tremendously important work to do. Now, as we attempt somewhat to scout this present and this future, it seems to me there are immediate and long-term issues. And I think in my dialogue by email with Michael, we both agreed that we're in the midst of an immediate and ongoing crisis. As I was having a coffee just to prepare for this, I reminded myself that probably even while we're meeting, hundreds of people are being slaughtered in Ukraine. I mean, sometimes when I watch the statistics and so on, I can't help feeling if I haven't landed back in World War I. But the amount of destruction of humans and missiles aimed at civilian infrastructure and war crimes and so on that will go on today is just unimaginable. But we need to, in some way, attend to it. So immediate issues here in Europe, we're amidst a major crisis. It felt to me like we were just staggering out of the pandemic, and before we could get our heads around what had happened in the pandemic, the sounds of war were back in Europe. Now, I think for my American friends, they are geographically distant from this. But I think as Biden and others have recognized, what is going on in Ukraine has repercussions for the rules-based international order that was decided upon after World War II. And if this is handled wrong and goes bad, it could have catastrophic consequences, not just for Europe and the UK, but for other countries as well. So I encourage our American friends to be as engaged as possible. Michael, for example, notes quite correctly that we do not know how the war will end, but end it will. And one question I have for Michael is, knowing the world of diplomacy. So, you know, for people like myself, I can only imagine the life that Michael has lived. And I hope as I get to know him better to learn more about it. But knowing the world of diplomacy, what kind of actions should we be taking as ordinary citizens today in order to help tip the scales in favor of a just outcome? So I do want to remind us all that a hinge of history may be upon us, but that must not reduce us to fatalism, as though there's some kind of determinism that we have no power at all. We are not God. We are very limited, but we do have power. And we live, I think, all of us on the Zoom, in democracies, and we may need to recover some of that power and see if we can use it towards a just outcome. And then I make a comment, which I've already asked about the united response by the West and NATO. What I want to finish on, or take the rest of my time on, I've still got about another 9 minutes, is longer term reflections. And I think this is what really struck me, is how a diplomat thinks like Michael and how a philosopher, theologian like Craig Bartholomew thinks. So when I really sat down to write about Michael's article, it sort of sparked me in the following sort of directions. So over the longer term, this is a much longer thing. This is not, I think, necessarily the immediate crisis. This reflects back into the present. But I think that a gift, if I may put it that way, in huge inverted commas, of this absolutely dreadful war is to call the West back to explore and recover its identity. And maybe countries like South Africa too, and countries in the majority world. War, with all its horror, always poses questions that it invites us to answer. And one question I suggest is the identity of the West. Who are we? And what are our core values? Vladimir Zelensky has emerged as an extraordinary leader, and the comparison with Winston Churchill is often made. But I can't help wondering if the United Kingdom and our Western democracies, could we produce a leader with the best qualities of a Zelensky? So if we hold Vladimir with all his faults, but also with his extraordinary courage, how will we ever forget, I don't need a ride out of here, I need weapons to fight. If we hold him up as a mirror, how do we in the West look reflected in that mirror? Now, this is going to be a bit academic for some folk, but please just hang in there. And, you know, the thing that I want to reflect on a bit is, where are we in the West at the moment? So on the one hand, with Michael, I'm incredibly encouraged by the way in which the West is united. I mean, in ways I didn't think would be possible in resisting this barbaric invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, I have some grave questions about the health of the West and ways in which it may inadvertently have contributed to this very situation in Ukraine. So, you know, when I was doing my PhD through Bristol University, this was around 1990. I forget where you were at this time, Michael, but around 1990, I was doing my doctorate, and postmodernism had just really started to hit the academic world. And as some of you will know, and excuse the analogy, but a bit like a virus, it just spread to every discipline. So even as we live amid something of its demise, in my view, no matter what discipline you're in now, there's a literature on postmodernism and your discipline. Now, what is postmodernism about? Well, it's a radical critique of the tradition that emerges out of the Enlightenment, what we might call the post-Enlightenment tradition. And it critiques, and in some ways, I think very insightfully. I mean, there's a lot about postmodernism that I liked, but the direction in which it went, I think we should have seen was potentially very dangerous. And to use an analogy, so what it did, postmodernism, was challenge the very notion of right method getting us to the truth about the world in which we live, but without abandoning the core premise of the post-Enlightenment tradition of human autonomy. Now, if that makes no sense to you, you'll like my illustration. As postmodernism swept through from France into Britain and was hugely welcomed and is still in the major American universities, my image of the postmodern scholar was sitting on the branch of the tree of human autonomy while sawing off the branch at the same time. That is what has been blowing in and out of our universities since about 1989, 1990, and continues into the present. And of course, it's the universities that produce the leaders in our culture and the elites and so on and so forth. Now, you don't need too much imagination to see that sitting on a branch while sawing it off is probably not going to end well. Okay, and the path that it took so much of the Western thinkers and academy down was towards the position where the very possibility of truth was placed in question. So this is the kind of thing that has taken hold in the thinking centers of the Western world, in Europe and in America, that, you know, we can't really tell the truth, and there really is no big difference in some extreme forms between history and fiction, and on and on and on it goes. Now, what on earth has this got to do with Michael's article? Well, I think it has the following to do with Michael's article. The lecture that sparked the postmodern debate and then this extraordinary development in the academy was a lecture in 1989 by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. Now, you don't have to be interested in that, but do you remember what else happened in 1989? The fall of the Berlin Wall. So it's extremely interesting to me that at the very time when the USSR was crumbling, the West was embarking on a trajectory that would undermine the very possibility of truth. Now, to bring that right into the present and to show you where that trajectory has led us to, without wanting to spark a discussion on this, what is the question that contemporary politicians most fear? Well, here in the United Kingdom and in lots of Europe and Australia and parts of America, the question that politicians most fear nowadays is, what is a woman? So I think, you know, we've got to learn to start connecting these dots. I spent 5 years of my academic life working on a postmodern philosopher. What I didn't spend time doing, and what no one around me was spending time doing, was sitting down and saying, if this is taking hold in the West, where is it likely to lead? We failed to even attempt to scout the future. But there's a direct link between this subversion of the possibility of truth and a president like Donald Trump, who could lie endlessly and remain so terribly popular, and someone like Vladimir Putin, who can simply say, I'm not going to invade Ukraine, I'm not going to invade Ukraine, and continue to lie. I mean, the level of projection is just mind-blowing. It wasn't him who invaded Ukraine, it was Ukraine who attacked Russia. Now, do you see what is at stake in all of this? Is we cannot survive in a world in which the possibility of truth is not taken seriously. And yet we in the West are the ones who have welcomed and celebrated a movement that to a large extent creates those conditions for the radical subversion of the truth, so that it's all my truth and your truth. Now, the one thing with war, when I was working on postmodernism, the one thing that will not allow history to be collapsed into fiction is the Holocaust. This horrendous, horrendous thing in the 20th century, it absolutely resists the desire to collapse history into fiction. And so a very strange gift from the Ukrainians is to put back on the Western agenda the possibility of truth, to be able, as Scott Peck says in People of the Lie, to name evil when it appears on your doorstep. The great American historian Gertrude Himmelfarb says in modernity, scholars were aware that abysses harbored monsters. In postmodernism, scholars play around the abyss, pretending there are not monsters that can be unleashed. So a significant gift, I think, of this terrible time is to remind us. The final thing that I wanted to put on our agenda for discussion was, which makes me weep because I'm a South African, and during the apartheid era, on the whole, not entirely, but on the whole, in a country where 66% identified as Christians, on the whole, the church failed to confront the racism that was staring it in the face every day. If you read the history of the church in South Africa, there was opportunity after opportunity after opportunity for the church to stand up and say no, and to a large extent, it did not. And the effects of that, I think, linger today as the new South Africa still struggles to be healthily born. What distresses me beyond belief is that the Russian Orthodox Church is woven into the fabric of Russia. And you see their leader regularly at the meetings that Putin addresses. And of course, a thing that could make a difference today, could probably stop the war, is if Russian Orthodox priests across Russia stood up and said, no. So this, for me, is a perplexing and a tragic issue. Now, Michael, those are my thoughts in response to you. So thank you for stimulating me so much. We'll give you some time now just to respond as you wish, and then it's on to Q&A.
I'll just unmute. Okay, a lot of points there, and I think I admire the way that you've taken the issue out of this war into a much more sort of fundamental moral dimension. But I have to say that we've been here before. One of the things I've spent today doing is reading. How many of you, put up your hand if you can, have heard of George Kennan? George Kennan, an American diplomat who in 1946 wrote what is called the Long Telegram. And it was really about how to answer the question, how do we deal with a Soviet Union in 1946 that is proving to be obstructive, aggressive, and determined to pick a fight with the West? And how do we deal with a country that is almost certainly going to have nuclear weapons before long and avoid coming to an existential struggle which will destroy both of our country, both of our partners and countries, and even the world. And the telegram was extremely influential and drove American and more widely Western policy towards the Soviet Union along a path of containment. And so much of it is relevant to today in deciding how to deal with a junkyard dog like Putin, roaming around our suburban neighborhood, wanting to bite everything in sight. Do you try and kick the dog? Do you starve it? Do you feed it? Do you give it what it wants? Do you invite it into your house? How do you deal with this? So these questions are not necessarily new. They didn't start, last year. I'm not suggesting anyone is saying they did, but the question of how far do you go down the sort of the sort of race to the bottom with a rogue state, with a criminal in your backyard? Sort of the movie On the Waterfront was about how do you confront evil in your own backyard, and at what point do you say, I'm going to put my life on the line and confront it? So I would say that there is a lot of experience out there, and this is not the first time we've confronted it. The second thing I would say is that I think, in terms of one of your most interesting questions was, what do we do as citizens? And I think the answer is, I set myself against what a lot of Ukrainians are recommending, which is that we should shun Russia and its people and its culture and its literature and everything about it until they turn on Putin and themselves stop this war. I think that's the wrong strategy. I think what we have to do, it's all the more important to foster relationships and show willingness to accept Russia into the fold of nations when all this is over, and that we're not going to keep them in the doghouse for several generations without any possibility of reconciliation or remission. I think on a personal level, I haven't mentioned this, I wasn't necessarily going to, but I have 4 Ukrainians staying in my house, and from them I've learned all sorts of things, including that Ukraine is not, paradise on earth. For them, life before the war was very tough. It's a corrupt, unequal, chaotic sort of country that's trying to do better for itself. It's also improved my Russian to the point where I've got the fluency back. But I mean, the world's a complicated place. It's not just heroes and villains. And I think there are all sorts of ways in which we can reach out to Russian institutions and artists and friends and so on. I have Russian friends in London who are distraught at what's happened. Another Russian friend that I've made recently in the last year, who cannot bear to go back to Russia because of the ignorance and bigotry of so many of her family and friends, who just cannot see what is happening in Ukraine and completely buy the Russian line. So I think my advice would be to engage where we can, while making it clear that some things are just unacceptable, and that the rules of a rule-based order of international relations have never been more important, and they're not that difficult. I mean, I wrote down the five things. This is not. I could have looked it up on the internet, but these are the things that struck me: that respect for sovereign equality and national determination, respect for territorial integrity, non-aggression, respect and adherence to international treaties, which Putin did not do, non-interference in other countries, and guarantees for basic human rights and freedoms. That's not a big ask. There are a lot of countries we wouldn't want to live in, who could actually subscribe to that. And so I think there's a lot at stake here, and we've got to plan for the end game when the war is over. What sort of relationship we're going to be with this 150 million people that we call, the Russian state, the Russian empire. And the other thing I want to say is, Churchill was a great leader, but he was a great wartime leader. He was not a great peacetime leader. He stood against Indian independence. He stood against the welfare state. He stood against a lot of the the progressive reforms of the post-war era. And people think it's very unfair to kick him out after the Second World War, after all he'd done to save us from fascism. But he wouldn't have been much good at it, quite likely. So, Zelensky, cometh the hour, cometh the man, but I'm not sure, how much of a stomach he has, in due course. And we don't all want to be like Zelensky necessarily. So I'll just stop there and